The Research Left Behind with Professor Ashley.
Hello, hello. Welcome. We're at The Research Left Behind. I'm Professor Ashley. Welcome. I am a real professor. I teach people how to make video games, and tonight I am joined by Dr. José Zagal. But welcome to The Research Left Behind. This is the only Twitch stream, YouTube show, and podcast, depending on your mode of access, which sweeps the cutting room floor to bring you the research that got left behind. So, as I mentioned, tonight I'm joined by Dr. José Zagal, who is on this really cool TV screen monitor. Oops. Whoa. There we go. It's live television, everyone. This is exciting. So Dr. Zagal is the author of hundreds of conference papers, articles, conference presentations, books, and papers on the subject of gaming, learning, and literacy. But tonight, we're just going to be focusing on one. Tonight, we're talking about Seeing Red, the Nintendo's Virtual Boy. That's the name of the book. And if you want to go and read it right now for free, you can type !book into chat, and you will get a link to go and download it. If you're watching or listening after the fact, please check the episode's description for that link. Either way, this book is free for you to read thanks to MIT Press's Open Access Fund. So, faculty, students, staff, adjuncts, please join me in welcoming Dr. José Zagal.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm super happy to be here. I'm excited to talk about the book. I appreciate everything that's going to happen today. So looking forward to it.
Well, I tried to keep it relaxed in a relaxed atmosphere, but we'll see. We'll see what kind of chaos Twitch brings us. So right before we get started talking about the book, in addition to any tech chaos we might experience, I also need to go through our conflict of interest disclosures. We are proper professors, right? So this is a segment of the show where we talk about basically how we know each other, and the conflict of interest thing is totally a joke. There is no HR department here. There is no ethics review board here. The only thing we got is Nifty Chris, our moderator. A round of applause for Nifty Chris, please. I'm having too much fun with the sound effects. Okay, so Jose, do you remember how we met?
I'm going to guess that I met you when you were a PhD student. It was probably at a conference. My guess would be a DIGRA conference. That's the Digital Games Research Association conference. The question is which one? I'm going to guess it was the one in UK at Brunel University. That would have been 2009. If not, it might have been the one in Ilfana, which was maybe a couple years later. Is that about right?
About right, yeah. You have a really good memory. Yeah, this is true. And we, of course, know each other now because we're coworkers, so.
Yes. I guess in the spirit of COA, I'm not being paid to be here. I'm not expecting to be paid. You can read the book for free. If you want to buy a copy, that's also appreciated. Some people prefer reading on paper, so that's cool. I'm also not paying to be here. I guess COA, I guess it can go both ways. This is totally non-paid promotion by anybody. It's just academics I guess I'm the academic who likes to talk about his work. I'm guessing other people like to listen, and I'm guessing you like to talk to people about their work too.
Yeah, I mean, this is really a situation where everyone is helped by just learning more. And frankly, I'm a nosy person. And in the process of writing my most recent book, I end up having to cut a lot of content out for word count. And because some of my ideas just didn't, Jose is the perfect person to have as the first guest on the show because he had the displeasure of having an office that was right next to mine. So he was the person who got to hear about all my bad ideas that got cut out. So I thought, well, I want a venue to talk. I would love a venue to talk about these things, but I bet other people have gone through this too. So this is completely free. I mean, thank you for watching. Thank you for watching this, but otherwise no money is changing hands here. But yeah, it's a pleasure to work with you and also to have you on the program.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm super excited.
What are you drinking?
I guess it's trying to figure out which side to show the camera. It's a can. of yerba mate, with a
Oh.
special peach flavor.
I am drinking water because despite the fact that I was like, oh, I want a cool bar atmosphere, I also wanted to pay homage to late night talk show hosts who I always thought growing up as a kid they were drinking coffee because they would drink out of a coffee mug. And then I found out much later on that was probably alcohol. But mine is water. Okay, so to get to the research left behind, seeing Red's Virtual Boy, Nintendo's Virtual Boy, pardon me. First, I think congratulations are due, even if they're belated congratulations, because the book came out last year in 2024 from MIT Press as part of their platform study series. And you must be incredibly proud because, as everyone knows, chat included, publishing a book is extremely difficult and extremely hard work. And getting a book that's open access is even harder work. So very well done. Congratulations. Well done, you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very proud of this one because it did go through a really long and self-inflicted, torturous process before we were able to finally get a manuscript out the door. So it felt like a huge relief when it was actually out the door at the publisher, and they're like, "We got it from here," and they took it the rest of the way.
Yeah, editors are godsends as well. So, chat, if you have questions that you would like to ask Professor Zagal, please write them in text in the chat. We have our lovely HR department, just kidding, our lovely mod, Chris, who will collect all your questions and then kind of copy and paste them back to us at the end of the show with any remaining time we have. But for now, we're going to get into discussing the research left behind. So, Seeing Red, Nintendo's Virtual Boy is co-authored with Benj Edwards. And so one of the things that I'm interested in that I think early career researchers and also PhD students would probably be interested in that I don't feel like it's talked about enough in higher education is how did you two go about co-authoring the book? Like, what was your strategy? What kind of tech did you use? If you used a special like co-writing technology, like I'm saying technology, but like Google Docs.
So I guess at this point, I probably had to explain the long and torturous process. So initially, this was not a co-authored book. I was going to be the only author on it. I've been working on it for easily a dozen years. And when I say working on it, I mean, it was a project that I had it sort of moved between back burner, some activity had happened, back to back burner, and so on. The series editors at MIT Press for this book is in a series called Platform Studies. Nick Montfort and Ian Bogos are the editors of that series. And I had initially approached them about doing a Virtual Boy book. This was when I was at DePaul University in Chicago. This must be like 15 or 16 years ago.
It was actually when the Virtual Boy came out.
No, it was old then, but not that. It was, I guess, less retro than it is now, obviously. It was actually a good time to start researching the book because, like, used games and collector games, like the Virtual Boy was still pretty cheap, but that was just my being lucky, essentially. I sent them a book proposal. It wasn't very good. They recognized it as not very good and said, well, like, here's some things you need to fix and then kind of send us a new one. It took me forever to do that. And once I eventually did, they were much happier about it. It was a much better proposal, I think. But I also realized, like, in the many years that passed in between, that I was really struggling to sort of bring this project kind of onto the front burners. It was always getting pushed aside by something else, either I was busy. Whatever it was that seemed more urgent at the moment was the thing that was getting my attention. And so I sat down and kind of realized, well, maybe what I need here is a co-author who can both contribute to the project, but also by having a co-author, I might be able to sort of feel more responsible to someone else, in this case, the co-author, to make progress on this thing and move it along. So I started thinking about, well, who would I like to collaborate on this? And one of the things I was interested in with this book, and one of the things I really enjoyed about the Platform Studies book series as a whole, is that the first book in the series, Racing the Beam, actually was really popular outside of academia. I got a lot of attention from game developers and game fans. And I think one of the reasons for that was that the book was really accessible and kind of easy to read and flow. And so I'm not a particularly good non-academic style writer, to the extent that I'm even okay in academic style. I'm worse in the your typical prose writing. And so I thought, well, maybe I could benefit from a co-author who is not an academic, who has an interest in the topic, in the platform. And so what I bring to the table is sort of the academic side of things, and what my co-author would bring to the table would be, their ability to communicate more effectively, more clearly, a better understanding of sort of the general, how to communicate with the general public. And in addition, and what both of us bring to the table would be sort of interest in games. And so that's when I reached out to Benj, because Benj had actually published an article many years ago on the Virtual Boy itself. He had gone out, he had interviewed the Americans behind the technology that Nintendo then licensed for the Virtual Boy. And so I knew he had an interest in that. I knew he could write, and he was interested in games. He also has a blog, and he was doing podcasts and stuff. And so he seemed like a person who might be interested in this kind of wacky, sure, I'll collaborate with an academic writing sort of an academic style book for an academic press in an academic context.
So was this
thankfully for me,
was this practically a cold call? You hadn't worked together before?
Yeah. We had not met, we had not talked. It was a cold call email, basically. Said, hey, my name is so-and-so. I'm working on this thing. I'm looking for blah, blah. And he replied, and we chatted, and kind of talked about what the expectations were, both from my end, what I was expecting from him, and then what he was interested in, and so on. One of the things I felt was important to outline is, look, this book would not make any of us millionaires. So if you're interested in writing a book, is, oh, cool, we can make X many thousands of dollars. I wanted him to know that would be very unlikely, right?
It's true.
And so that's when we started chatting. And at that point, I already had sort of initial drafts for some of the chapters, not the whole book. But I knew what the other chapters were about. And so we talked about what the plan for the book was. As part of our conversations, if I remember correctly, I sent him the drafts of what I had so he could take a look. Because I think he was also fairly kind of a bit of a skeptic, I don't know about this. Academics are all kind of super stuffy and really boring. And I think when he read what I sent him, he was like, okay, well, at least it might be kind of boring, but at least you do care about the platform and you're interested in kind of really taking it seriously. So in terms of our process, we scheduled, regular meetings. I can't remember if it was every week or every other week. And the way I like to collaborate is basically it's as primitive as it gets. I have a Word file, and I'll work on it, and then send it over the fence. Benj will look at it, turn on, track changes, make edits, and so on, and then back it comes, and so on. And for myself, that really helped to actually kind of sit down and set the time aside to actually do the writing that needed to happen. He contributed to all the writing as well. Different chapters were well, I think we should talk about this, and so he would write that section. He did all the appendices, which is kind of where we go into detail on each of the different games, and his role was really important because even for the chapters I had written, there were parts and sections that needed to be kind of improved and corrected, and some of it was also sort of fact-checking and making sure that the numbers were the right numbers. He also had access to images and stuff like that. So it was a really good collaboration where I felt we were each bringing our strengths to the table. I'm super happy we did that. The book would not have come out without Benj, that's for sure.
Oh, we love it when co-authors show love for each other. So before we get too far into the actual book, I wanted to have you describe what the Virtual Boy is. So with the full acknowledgement that we'll be doing a podcast audio version of this, so folks aren't necessarily going to be able to look up a picture of the Virtual Boy while they're driving. You do a really good job describing its functionality, but also kind of how goofy it looks. So I was wondering if you could reiterate that part of the first chapter where you talk about what it looks like, also that it was mistaken for virtual reality when in reality it didn't have the head movement or the system for eye tracking that is necessary for virtual reality. So it's kind of a goofy piece of equipment, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, do you mean describe it what it looks like physically? Or
yeah, absolutely. I want you to try and put words to.
Oh, man. Okay, so I guess we start with, imagine an old school virtual reality helmet. This one is in red and black plastic, so red on top and kind of black on the bottom. It's got a visor that doesn't strap onto your head. It's got a visor, and it stands on, I'm going to call it a tripod. It's not really a tripod, but there's a metal stand with 2 legs. So it's stationary on a surface. On the side underneath, there's a place where you plug in the controller. It has a cable. The controller is black. It's, I guess I would describe it as the same style as a PlayStation controller. There's a standard name for that shape. I guess it's like an M. I guess it looks like an M. 2 sort of handlebars on each side. A bunch of buttons. It's symmetrical, so the buttons on the left are the same as the buttons on the right. There's also some trigger buttons. And the cartridges are placed underneath from behind, I guess. And to play it, you have to turn it on. The controller itself has a battery holder, so it's sort of weighty, and that's where the on-off switch is. You turn it on, and then you sort of lean into the visor. And once you've leaned into the visor, you can't see the outer world. There's no light coming in. And all the graphics are red. It's basically red and black. Black being no color, essentially. Different shades of red.
Would you say 50
in
Shades?
terms of, no, more than that. Well, more or less, that's a tricky question to answer, like 100% accurately. But yeah, it's a bunch of different shades of red. The graphics are mostly, I think we call it sort of pixel graphics. It's not polygons generally. There are a couple games that do have the wireframe polygons, but it's typically you're looking at basically it's like looking at a Mario Super Nintendo era game, but all red.
And so that's where the name of the book comes from.
Yes, seeing red. Well, I mean, the name of the book is going to a bunch of things, right? Because yes, the graphics are red, the device is red, the plastic is red on it. But also, it was sort of famously didn't do well, right? So Nintendo launched it and then canceled it pretty quickly. And so it's sort of seeing red, like red on the ledger in a way. That's also like, so it's, multiple levels of playing on words that are going on here for the title.
That is so clever. I didn't get that. That's me. That's a Ashley problem, but that did not occur to me. That's really clever. I was thinking seeing red like when you're really angry. And I thought that it was because Nintendo is really angry that did do well, but that's not. That's an uncharitable read, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like, I'm not sure if Nintendo would have been angry that it didn't do very well at the time. And the reasons are sort of circumstantial to what Nintendo was going through. And Nintendo's been very tight-lipped about a bunch of things. So at the moment when the Virtual Boy came out, Nintendo was really far behind, being late essentially with the successor to the Super Nintendo system. So what would eventually become the N64. We're way behind. PlayStation had already come out. People were excited by PlayStation. There's a bunch of other consoles that come out too. And so Nintendo was really slow to get their stuff out, essentially. In that sense, for many people, Virtual Boy seemed like it's a stopgap. Like, let's release this thing now, just to remind people that we exist, that we have, that we're still making video games. We're still relevant in this industry. But this is like mid-90s, 95. So, my hypothesis here is that as soon as they pulled the plug on it quickly, because that allowed them to divert resources to the Nintendo 64, which was struggling to make progress to hit like ready for launch, essentially. So in that sense, we could say the Virtual Boy paid the price to save Nintendo 64 and keep sort of Nintendo alive as a company. If it had done really well, who knows what would have happened? I mean, maybe that money would have been spent into other resources or so, to hire more people. I don't know. I don't know how that would have worked actually.
Yeah.
It's an interesting counterfactual. Like, what if it had sold like gangbusters? Would Nintendo have just forgotten about the N64? Would they have delayed it for as long as they took them to get it out there? I don't know.
Would we be currently having a trade war? It's butterfly effect, right? So on that note, why write a book about the Virtual Boy in that capacity? Because the book, Seeing Red, goes through and talks a lot about how in most ways the Virtual Boy was a commercial failure. And I have a question about how now it's this kind of kitschy icon, but why write a book about it?
So I was intrigued by the Platform Studies series, which I thought was a really cool series. And I thought the virtual was cool. And to be honest, like my first pitch was basically, and this is a bad pitch for an academic book, but this is where I started from, was, hey, this is a cool device that we could talk about as a platform because contrary to other platforms, this one has a very limited set of games that came out for it. And so you could actually examine all of it. It's sort of like saying, let's talk about an artist, and we're just going to look at all the music they did because they died really young and they only had 5 albums and a couple of Fun Finish songs, and that's it. If you look at some of the other books in the series, it's like there's 1,000 games for this platform. So I thought it was a cool opportunity where you could cover everything. That was the first pitch, and that's where I started. I thought, wouldn't it be cool? And obviously that got shot down because it was a bad pitch. Because really, it's like, what's the point? Like, cool story, but like, is there there? And so in the intervening years, I had to kind of think about it more carefully and sort of kind of understand what was this device doing, and kind of, in a sense, rescue it, and in a way. I don't mean like I'm saving it from like its inglorious like reputation. It's supposed to be sort of recognizing its place in video games, and that's just the fact that it failed is less interesting than what was it and what was it trying to do. And in putting together the book, I sort of realized, wow, like the moment when it came out was like a really wild time in video games, and I hadn't seen people sort of writing about that, and it became really interesting to sort of realize that this was just like, it was like a blip, but it was a blip of what could have been a different path, evolutionary path for games, essentially. And then also realizing that, because people kind of also always bring it up as like this unique thing that sort of came out of nowhere, and it was VR, maybe VR was hot, but it's still like it's this unique thing, and then realizing, well, actually, it isn't that unique in the context of what do humans like to do for entertainment. And in that sense, the virtual boy is like a specific flavor of entertainment that we've enjoyed that goes back hundreds of years, right? And so I thought, once I sort of had those like epiphanies and made those connections, then the book itself made a lot more sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you ended on this idea that what the Virtual Boy did wasn't necessarily super unique, in that people have been playing with perspectives for hundreds of years, which is absolutely my next question. So that might, for folks who are not accustomed to gaming, the statement of, well, we got Virtual Boy at home, we've had Virtual Boy for 500 years, what are you talking about? Seems really strange, right? Because we typically think of technology as constantly being new and innovative and the hot new thing, cutting edge technology, so on and so forth. But the book is really careful to describe the type of visual play that the Virtual Boy uses has been around for centuries. So I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, there's actually two strands of this. One is Gunpei Yokoi, who's like the claimed sort of inventor of the Virtual Boy, or not the technology itself, but of this device, and his design philosophy, which you do cover in the book. But also this broader idea of what do humans like to do to amuse themselves, and one category of things is to look at things that surprise us or seem interesting. And you think of like optical illusions, a lot of like why do we enjoy optical illusions? Because like we like to be fooled or tricked. And so in that context, what the Virtual Boy does with its auto stereoscopic display, which is it's like a 3D movie. Like when you watch the movies with the glasses, it's that. So it looks 3D even if the image is not. In this case, there's 2 displays. I won't get into those details. So that kind of visual amusement, does have this longer tradition going back, like I said, easily hundreds of years. There's a couple that I thought were kind of interesting, and we sort of talk about in the book, are devices that we peer into. And you think of a kaleidoscope, for example, which is usually sort of monocular, just one eye. They twist around and see these cool patterns. There's also these devices that you would peer into, peat boxes, and to look at pictures. And if you think of early days of photography, a lot of people were really excited just to see an image of something else, right? So it's either curiosity, like, oh, I'm looking at pictures from far away land, or some crazy, steam engine going over a bridge and that kind of stuff. And actually, stereographic photography predates photography itself. This idea of having 2 pictures, you put them on a device, and you get this like 3D effect. That actually predates photography by like that much. But is kind of interesting. Is we didn't get photography and then like 3D photography. We got like 3D imagery, like autostereographs or stereographic images and the devices to look at them, and then we actually got photography right after that. And so Virtual Boy is sort of part of that tradition of seeing things in 3D when they're not really in 3D. So this illusion. There's a Mondo Nuevo devices that were sort of these dioramas inside of a box that you could peer into, and then they would have these different layers of elements. And this was hundreds of years ago, so there's no electricity, and you would like light candles to get different lighting effects or swap out certain panels, so you get like different sort of visual illusions of depth inside of a box that didn't have that thing.
So since
that's where it connects to this idea of like being amazed by looking at cool things, essentially. And I think holograms are like that too. I think we're just like, oh, so cool, there's this depth, and like to look shiny and so on. Like, I guess humans like air quotes shiny things to look at.
You heard it here first. So since this is the research left behind, I have to ask, did you physically go and look at any of these dioramas or any of these devices? I mean, surely we've all looked through a kaleidoscope, but did you seek any out to like go to any museums or anything?
Yes, there's a museum in Turin, Italy. It's a cinema museum, actually. And they had some really good devices and displays you could like play around with. It's in the context of cinema and moving images and so on. And I was lucky to be there for a different DIGRA conference.
Yeah.
I'm blanking on what year that one was. Great museum, and they had like a booklet. It's one of the few times, maybe it's the first and only time I bought like a museum guidebook and then sort of cited it in work later on. And so they talk about the history of like cinema, right? But they're sort of also going back to saying, well, looking at images and creating these illusions of depth and so on, which is a lot of what cinema does. And so they sort of trace some of that history, and that was super useful.
That's really awesome. And I'm glad it made it into the book, because I feel like I've definitely done that. Like, this museum's going to be really interesting and useful for my research. And then I'm just like, oh, well, I saw a lot of shiny things and I'm very happy now. But it never actually makes it in. So that's really heartening. So you talk about in chapter 3, when you're covering the development of the Virtual Boy, you talk about how the development of, I think you're talking specifically about VR, but we can extrapolate this to tech in general, is very different culturally in the United States. So a lot of our tech comes from military development funds, whereas in Japan, a lot of the tech was coming out of telecommunication, right? Looking at ways to bring people together and to give people some common ground or some means of communication. So I wondered if you could comment on that a little bit, about how the culture and our cultural approach to technology, and even our funding sources, right, to develop technology impacts our attitudes toward it.
I think it impacts both the attitudes, but also the people who are in the room when the things are getting made and they're kind of being, and people are imagining what they could be used for. And so that's why a lot of the US side tends to be sort of, there's military funding involved or military interests, or if you want to build this thing that you have a vision for, that's where you're going to get funding for it. And so that kind of is a move away from, let's say, entertainment, right? In case most of us more move into, well, this has to, the simulation, or this needs to be a tool that people can use to learn, or this needs to be a tool that people can use to do a certain job and stuff like that. And so that's, I was curious as to, well, why would a company in Japan be even interested in this, and what would they think about it, and how would they perceive it? And that's where I sort of tried to trace, well, yes, there was research happening on VR specifically in Japan, but it was a different community in many ways. Definitely a lot more art stuff, a lot more sort of creative imaginary, if it were. Now, to be fair, when I'm saying that these two cultures, this is absolutely like a straw person analogy. These are the both extremes, and
right.
This really is a spectrum, and there's some people that like moving back and forth and doing things on both sides of that like fake spectrum that I'm kind of describing here. What that means is that, and if you go back to like the early 90s, and maybe this is less so nowadays, there's also the idea like video games, like, oh, Japanese companies are making these quirky and kind of wonky games that are kind of cute and funny and very different from, let's say, like a shooter game that's happening, it's being made in US and so on. So there isn't anything wrong with with either of those, but it just means that they're coming from different sensibilities and different people have been invited into the room, right? So like, oh, we have more media artists who are doing stuff over here, and over here might be more educators, for example, and these are both good, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Can you think of another example outside of like United States and Japanese culture where there's a strong like you don't have to use this as an example, but how British culture, for example, impacts the development and kind of context in which we consume British games? You could use like Chile. You've just been working a lot on Chilean games, so I think that'd probably be a better example.
Yeah, I guess the bigger question here is to what extent does a local culture influence the media that, or the cultural products that culture produces? And the answer is obviously there is an influence. Maybe it's going away now because now there's a more concerted effort to make sure that whatever it is that you're making is also interesting to a global audience, for example. But I would say, for example, I feel that British games have a certain sense of humor that's slightly different than, let's say, humorous American games, for example.
Yeah.
Or European games, let's say French games, also have a different sensitivity and a different way they do animation. And I'm saying maybe that has to do with their comics culture, which is also very different. Or at least was, let's say, in the 80s and the 90s, maybe even into the thousands. I'm not enough of an expert in that to comment on it, like what's going on now, essentially. The kinds of stories they're telling in comics, then, well, you tell different kinds of stories in games as well. In the case of the Brits, there's a lot of sort of this sort of dark humor, sort of black comedy. If you think sort of Monty Python, okay, and then Blackadder, those like dark comedy, you see a lot of that in games, which then gets forgotten about, erased. Like a lot of people forget the Grand Theft Auto games were basically Scottish games. It's a Scottish studio making a game about the U.S. Specifically think like GTA 3, and they're like, oh, it's so funny, so satirical, so biting. It's like, yeah, that's how a bunch of Scots see the U.S. through U.S. media and kind of reflecting it back in a way. And so I think in the context of the Japanese games, some of that comes down to certain aspects of care that they have, certain levels of polish that they're really interested in the games. And then there's also specifically Nintendo, right? Nintendo is also, as its company, also has its very has its own design sensibility, right? The kinds of games that Nintendo would probably never make that I can imagine, for example.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer. And I think that you can see that with contemporary games. I'm thinking of Thank Goodness You're Here, which is a very funny British game. And the most recent game that everyone's obsessed with on the internet, Something 33, it's I guess ex-Ubisoft developers made this game that's supposed to be just absolutely beautiful, like breathtakingly beautiful. So I think that holds true with some contemporary recent examples I can think of. Let's go to my favorite question that I can possibly ask, because this is the question about Blockbuster Video.
Okay.
So, millennial chatters and listeners and viewers, this question's for you. So the book, I'm fingers crossed. We haven't discussed this offline, so this is a wish and a prayer that you ended up going down a researcher rabbit hole and some extra Blockbuster research ended up getting left behind, because it's brought up in the book. So chapter 6, you talk about the struggles that Nintendo had in marketing. We've talked about it. We did a little bit of a teaser trailer about this at the beginning of the episode. So consumers basically were confused, right? So the Virtual Boy comes out and people didn't really know what to do with it. And Nintendo eventually landed, their marketing team eventually landed, according to your book, on you just have to play it. Like if you play it, then you'll understand it, which then led them to have this partnership with Blockbuster Video, which up until this point, Nintendo was pretty anti-game rentals. In fact, the book mentions that they were instrumental in lobbying to get game rental companies banned in Japan, or having game rentals themselves banned, not companies, but that was an awkward way to phrase that. But so I'm going to read this quote that describes their relationship with Blockbuster Video, and then I want you to talk about why that's remarkable, and also how much research that got left behind on Blockbuster Video. So the quote reads, the idea that firsthand experience with the platform was the only way to truly understand it was also evident in Nintendo's surprise partnership with NBC and the video rental chain Blockbuster. Nintendo had decided to actively support and encourage the rental of its brand new just released video game platform. Starting on August 14th, which was launch day, and for a period of about 4 months, Blockbuster's customers were able to rent a Virtual Boy packed in a custom hardshell case and 2 games of their choice for 3 days for only US $9.95, so almost $10 US. And this is in I didn't write down. Was this 1993? No.
95 probably.
Okay, 95. Apologies. So 10. I mean, that was a little bit pricey, but still. Okay, so first of all, why is this remarkable? We've gotten a little bit of context, but I think you can more eloquently describe the tension Nintendo had with rentals, and then also tell us the juicy Blockbuster research that got cut out.
I guess the stuff that I would have liked to have gone into more detail on, but didn't make sense because it was like too much of a rabbit hole, was this prior relationship that Nintendo had with Blockbuster. And if I remember correctly, Nintendo had sued Blockbuster for copyright infringement, and didn't win, essentially. They might have settled. This is my memory going a bit hazy on the details.
That's so weird that you don't remember very nuanced Blockbuster lore. I'm very disappointed. Yeah. That's a joke.
And the copyright infringement also I thought was kind of interesting because basically what Blockbuster was doing is they were renting out original games. So these were original games. But they would photocopy the game manuals. And so if you rented, and they were renting all kinds of games. So it wasn't just Virtual Boy games. You could also rent, Sega Genesis games or whatever. So you get the game in a Blockbuster box or a case or something, and then the manual would have been photocopied and placed inside. And the cart was original, maybe had like an extra Blockbuster sticker on it or something like that. And so Nintendo was basically saying, hey, this is copyright infringement because you're basically making photocopies of our copyrighted material, which is our game manual, and like handing them out to customers. They weren't selling them directly to the customers. Like you couldn't buy a photocopy manual, but I'm pretty sure of that. And and they sort of been fighting this in court. And then all of a sudden, Nintendo goes like, "Oh, dang! How do we get people to understand the Virtual Boy?" They actually did a road tour of Virtual Boy. They would set up in different malls over the country, and you could like play the Virtual Boy there in person. But they realized that was not going to be enough, and so they realized, well, I guess we'll have to partner with Blockbuster. And so they made this deal where Blockbuster was, I'm guessing, happy to now have Nintendo sort of on board with them. But Nintendo was then like very shy about like bad mouthing Blockbuster like it had, prior to that in the context of the lawsuit. I also think at that time Sega was like, we don't care, rentals are cool, like yeah, go rent some games. And so there was also a bit of that Nintendo versus Sega stuff that was playing out in the context of the Blockbuster, with their Sega being the cool kids as it were, and Nintendo being the sort of the buttoned up, kind of like old school, like you don't understand the kids these days company. Seriously, so I knew that like everybody knew about the Blockbuster thing because if you went on eBay, that like you could buy the cases, right? It's like, oh, here's the Blockbuster rental case. But I don't know that anybody kind of looked into what that deal was about and how it worked and what the backstory for it was, which I thought that was kind of cool. And we couldn't go into in more detail, like the things I wish that this is like pre-cutting room floor stuff that got cut before it even got written, before it got written to get cut, would be like actually trying to track down some of those court documents to see what was out there, like each company, who said what, like how many rentals were they actually seeing, like how significant was the rental market in the video game industry at the time. I mean, those are questions that I think are still open, at least in my mind. I don't know if someone else is out there has done that. Because you see all these pie charts like, oh, the video game industry is like this many dollars, and this much is arcade, and this much is console, this much is PC, and so on. I was thinking, wow, what was rental? Because I'm sure there's a bunch of people that didn't have a console. They would just like rent games from Blockbuster. And was that a significant part of, like, if you tallied up all the Blockbuster rentals for video games, does that make the industry look a lot bigger than it was, or not? I don't know.
I thought you were going to ask for that pie chart, but the 1995 version that has the sliver for Virtual Boy specifically. But you're talking about
maybe a thin red line. There we go. would be my guess. I don't know. I mean, for all I know, Blockbuster, it is entirely possible that the Virtual Boy rental program was a lot of the source work. I could only tease out details through like press releases, and press releases tend to be very like, yay, everything's great, everything's wonderful, we're super happy. Everyone's always super happy in press releases, right?
Yeah.
I was like, we're so disappointed that, new press release, we sold a quarter of what we thought we would. So everyone's super positive. And so Blockbuster's like super happy, saying like, yeah, rental's going great. And there's like, yeah, we're also super happy. It'd be interesting to know like what those numbers were actually like. And my hypothesis is a lot of people basically rented the Virtual Boy and went, not so excited. Cool, glad I didn't spend this amount of money on it. And you did get a coupon, so if you did the rental, you got a coupon, so you could buy one afterwards for like a discount. But my hunch would be maybe did really well on the rentals because people were super curious, and then a lot of people were just like, yeah, I guess sure, I tried it once, it was fine. Don't need to buy it and have it at home. Like, what's the point? And perhaps also thinking if I ever want to mess around with it again, I could just rent it again from Blockbuster, not necessarily understanding that it was like going to be a short-lived thing. The rental program, in addition to the Virtual Boy getting canceled afterwards.
This is maybe an unfair question, not to you, but to the Virtual Boy, because what we know in games academia about those early rentals and why the rental model worked is because they were often using a design model for the games that grew off of arcade, right? So the point of an arcade game is to not only be fun, but to eat up quarters. And same thing with rental games, right? So when people complain about The Lion King for the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis and how difficult that game was, even though it was a kid's game, that was to keep you renting it, right? To extend your rental so that they can make more money. You're looking
I'm not sure that's the case.
Okay, well, you heard it here. Ashley lies.
No, lies. Actually, may be wrong. I don't know. I think of like the Aladdin and the Lion King too. Two notoriously difficult games, right? That were sort of kids games that were just really hard. My understanding of those two games is that they were just really hard because the people that made them were like, yeah, we're going to make a cool game. It's going to be really hard. And they weren't thinking like this is for kids. I remember reading on articles someplace where someone basically came in and talked to them. Was like, what the hell are you guys doing? This game is for kids. Like, you're not doing any user testing. This was before user testing was like a regular thing. And that's kind of part of the reason why they came out there. I'm not aware of any game companies making games for the rental market specifically. There might be a couple of titles. I don't want to sort of close that door. My understanding was this was just like a rental, let's say Blockbuster or like mom and pop shops, basically buying a bunch of games and then renting them out, essentially.
So actually, can you?
Like I said, they weren't necessarily doing it with the permission of the game company. So it's different than the rental model, for example. Like Blockbuster, when Blockbuster was renting out VHS tapes and DVDs, they had two options, right? One is I'm just going to buy a bunch of DVDs like a regular person would, paying full price for them and so on. Or I can buy a bunch of DVDs, maybe get a better deal on them because I'm going to buy so many. And then the movie company will make special version DVDs that are just for rental, for example, that have like no extra things, no added, no extra things, or the case might be slightly different and so on. But like I said, I'm not aware of any game companies basically making a game for rental. And this was the issue. A lot of game companies were like kind of upset because the part of the transition happening at this time, we're a bit behind actually, was like, what if I rent the game and I play over the weekend and I finish it and then I'm done? I'm never going to buy that game, essentially. And games at the time are actually a lot more expensive than they are now. If you look at prices for all the games, like, oh yeah, there's this Killer Instinct cartridge for Super Nintendo, $70, and it's $70 in 1995, right? So a lot of games are like really, really pricey. And so if you could just get your fill of it over the weekend, then you wouldn't buy it. So game companies were upset because of that. They couldn't do anything about it. And this is why Nintendo they couldn't sue Blockbuster just for renting. Because in the US, at least, under copyright law, you have the right of first sale, which basically means like if I bought the thing, I can then sell it on. I can do whatever I want with it, and within reason, essentially. That's why libraries work. Libraries just buy the books and then they can lend them out, and that's totally fine because they own those copies. So they couldn't go after them for that. They had to go after them they had to find some other way to attack Blockbuster in this case, and that's how they landed on the copyright infringement for the photocopy manuals.
That's so cool. Okay, so yes. So I was thinking that the developers were getting a slice of the rental pie, but this makes way more sense. This is one of those things that you hear or read once. I wish I could give you a source for where I heard this. Games are made really difficult because of blah blah blah. But I think it's just absorbed through osmosis at this point. I can't remember the citation I had, but that it was just like, oh well, that makes sense, right? Because I assumed that the developers and producers were getting a slice of the pie, but if they're not, then you're right, that would be total nonsense. That's really interesting.
Not to my knowledge. I'd be curious to know if there was some company that was basically, we're going to manufacture 10,000 copies of this game for Blockbuster because they're going to order a bunch of copies for us for all their stores or something like that. That might be the case. Like I said, like Sega was super happy with the rental, so maybe Sega had a special deal with Blockbuster where they produced a bunch of cartridges for games that were explicitly for the rental market. I think if there were any special copies, the Virtual Boy, because the pack-in game also had a separate release copy. So there are certain boxes that have like a Blockbuster sticker on them and so on. But I'm not sure if those are specially made for Blockbuster or just Blockbuster put stickers on them.
Yeah. Okay, so you didn't have to go to the last Blockbuster video for this book. Okay, well, that's disappointing. Killed a dream for me. Toward the end of the book, the chapter 8 in particular starts getting at why are we talking about the Virtual Boy? Why is it relevant to talk about these failure consoles or failure games? Which I think chapter 8 for me was one of the best chapters of the book. I found most interesting. And one of the things that it talks about is how it went from a disaster to forgotten. And in fact, I'd be shocked if some of our students knew what the Virtual Boy is or was, to being a cautionary tale, right? It's often pointed at as, look at this failure. But then it's been embraced now as a type of kitsch. I can't remember if your chapter uses the word kitsch or if I've just kind of put that in my notes because I read that chapter while eating chicken wings in a bar. So
as you do.
Yeah. That you heard it here, friends. Not only am I a liar, but I also work in bars. So there's a question here. There's a question, I promise. Mm-hmm. Which is, you talk about how the Virtual Boy is so beloved now in this kind of adorable icon. It appears as an Easter egg, not necessarily in literal Easter egg or how we would define Easter egg as an unlockable or something you have to discover. But for example, in Animal Crossing, it appears as an item that you can use to decorate your house. So I was wondering because maybe there's a repository online or maybe you found like a subreddit that's just places the Virtual Boy has appeared. But I imagine that you actually had to do quite a lot of legwork for this one sentence where you list all the different cameos the Virtual Boy makes. And I need you to talk about the research you had to do to find as many appearances of the Virtual Boy in media as you possibly could.
So you might be a bit disappointed here.
I would never be disappointed.
This is where we have to make like a huge shout out to the Virtual Boy fan community. There's a website called Planet Virtual Boy, which is sort of the place to go to for Virtual Boy information. A lot of the site, I think, is mostly static now in the sense that there's forums on it, but I don't remember. Like the forums have been kind of really slow for a while now. Everything's moved to a Discord server. So the Planet Virtual Boy community has been for years sort of cataloging and documenting and so on. Through my work, I was able to actually contribute some stuff back to the Planet Virtual Boy site as well, which made me proud, but also recognize like, hey, thanks for all the work that you guys did that like helped give me shoulders to stand on here. Let me give back to you as well. So a lot of these sort of sightings, Virtual Boy sightings, were sort of documented and sort of identified by fans in that community. So I didn't have to go hunting myself for any of them. And what I think is interesting here is that it's sort of Nintendo has sort of realized that the Virtual Boy can be like an easy thing to kind of throw in there as a sort of a wink, thing for their like deep lore fans, as it were, who will recognize like this name of this device or will see that picture in the background and go like, oh yeah, we know what that is. And so in that sense, I think Nintendo's sort of coming to terms with its past. for the longest time, the Virtual Boy was basically just like forgotten. Like, it's like, we never did this. Don't ask about it. Like, it's gone. Like, forget about it. Moving on. Like, nothing to see here. And I think it's now that they've realized that they do have fans that have a lot of appreciation for it, that they sort of, realized, actually, and maybe this is because some of the people who worked on it aren't around, quite literally, passed away, that they feel that they can sort of bring it back in a way that doesn't bring, say, shame, so on. But I thought one of the things that we did in that chapter, which I was surprised by, is one of the things I did, and Bench as well, obviously, is we went back and like, how were people talking about the Virtual Boy when it came out? Because if you look for stuff about the Virtual Boy, often it's like looking back, and they'll say like, oh yeah, like the Virtual Boy is a huge disaster and so on. But what were people saying about it contemporaneously with the platform being live? And we realized that it didn't have all this hate, essentially. It didn't have all this disdain. And that disdain only started appearing, and this by looking at game magazines. Again, major shout out to the magazine scanning fan communities. Of all the game historians, like most of the game historians are not hired or paid to be historians, who are collecting those materials, scanning them, making them available. So major shout out to them as well. Ancient Archive, huge resource. Always making sure to donate. If you have the money, you should also donate and support them. And sort of realizing, people only started to talk about the Virtual Boy in the games media when Nintendo was announcing like a next thing, and there were kind of doubts, is this going to work or not? So, for example, when Nintendo started to talk about the Nintendo DS, the two-screen handheld device, that's sort of when it started to hit peak, like people talking, like in game reporter spaces, like, well, they've announced their new like handheld, and it's kind of strange. It's got two screens, and one is a touchscreen. This better not be like the Virtual Boy, and that's when the Virtual Boy started to pick up that reputation. So it wasn't contemporaneous with the device. It was, a couple of years later. I don't know if it's like maybe 8 years later. So it had been out and canceled long enough that people didn't necessarily remember it at that time. And so a lot of game journalists could talk about it as a thing like, well, I know my history, so let me tell you about this. Better not be like the Virtual Boy, because we all know how that went, and didn't go well commercially for Nintendo. And then that turned the corner. It basically was becoming like, well, actually, it was kind of a quaint device. It was cute. It's an anomaly. It's a weird, it's like a weird stepchild that is kind of like has its own charm, essentially. And so in that sense, I think a lot of that discourse was not through people that owned it, but through games journalists covering games and kind of discussing what Nintendo was doing into the future.
Yeah, maybe we're all, maybe there's a little Virtual Boy in all of us in that way. We're all a little awkward. We're all a little forgotten. We're all a little talked about by journalists. No, I'm kidding. No, I love that description. And I think that gets to the penultimate question, which is, why should games academics, games researchers, or anyone really be talking about things that were not a commercial success, or in this case, actively in a lot of ways not user-friendly, poorly marketed, right? Like in talking about these failures, and I'm putting air quotes around failures, because anytime a game is made, anytime a console is made, that is incredible. That is an achievement. So in no way, shape, or form am I trying to disparage anyone who worked on the Virtual Boy or any of the games. And I think, as you just said, it wasn't, the conversation about being a failure was not happening while it was out. It was more of a retrospective piece anyway. But even things that we think of or in the popular imagination are quote unquote failures. Why bother researching them or talking about them?
I think a lot of it has to do with uncovering a different story, or a story that runs counter to like the commonly accepted notion.
Yeah.
I think if I had been unable to like understand the Virtual Boy in its context, then maybe the book would have never come out, because the book would have been like, yeah, this thing. I guess what I'm saying is I think it's fair to say there are probably devices that were released and then kind of disappeared and did nothing and weren't interesting and didn't come out in a context that was interesting either. And so maybe we don't need to bother too much with them. Some people would say like, hey, we should study everything. But I'm in the more realist phase of say, well, we can't study everything, but how do we make sure we're not leaving things behind that we should not have been leaving behind? And one of the things I learned, which was surprising, because I was alive when the Virtual came out. I was, old enough I could have bought one, by myself, sort of thing. sort of the things that you forget, right? And people think of when people talk about the console wars, they go, oh, it was this versus that. But you don't know that there were maybe 5 other competitors that, in hindsight, like, well, those never stood a chance and they disappeared and they failed commercially and they're gone. But at that moment in time, people didn't know what was going to succeed. Nobody knew. And the Virtual Boy came out at that moment, specifically when graphics were moving from 2D to 3D, when the internet was starting to take off, when multimedia computers were like really hitting their stride in the sense of like, hey, look, now on the personal computer, you can have different kinds of experience you can have before. CD-ROMs, multimedia, like all this stuff is happening. Virtual reality, like all these things were happening, and people were like, well, who's gonna win? Like, what's gonna happen? And no one knew, right? And if you just look at major consoles released in this like short period of a couple of years, people think like, oh well, there was a Sega one, and there was this one, and then there was a PlayStation, and the Nintendo. It's like you think it's 3, and then some people might be like a bit more knowledgeable and know 4 or 5. It turns out there's like 10. I don't remember exactly how many. Don't quote me on it. It was exactly 10. Well, they went nowhere. But again, you have to go back to at that moment in time when no one knew: is the internet a fad? Is VR a fad? Is CD-ROMs multimedia a fad? Are full motion video games a fad? People were talking about Sillywood, like computer games hitting Hollywood, and we'll have a new kind of entertainment, and that's going to be the future. Those died then. Now they're coming back again. And so in that sense, the Virtual Boy was like the perfect excuse to tell that story. And I think that story is interesting, and the Virtual Boy's role and place in it is also interesting. It's not about the unsung failed consoles as a general rule, I think. It's more about, does a particular device have a story around it that is interesting and that is like insightful, that is saying something that we don't know or we haven't thought about.
Yeah, that's a perfect answer. I love that. We are on the ultimate question now. So chat, as we get ready to walk off into the sunset, if you have any questions, now's the burning time to put them in chat, and we will answer them after my final question, which is, we've covered a lot of the book. We've discussed a lot of the research that went into the book. And we've done a bit of exploration about the research that got left behind on the cutting room floor. But I'm going to ask you very broadly, very generally, what piece of research that you collected for this book got left on the cutting room floor that you would like to tell us about?
So I really wanted to go into a lot more detail on all the games for the Virtual Boy. That ended up being an appendix, and Ben did an amazing job with that appendix. But we really wanted to tell more stories of like the developers behind the games and the connections between them, if any, and kind of the stories of how those games came to be. So that got left on the cutting room floor. The other thing that was a huge shock to me when I saw that was, so for a hot minute, I subscribed to a website called newspapers.com. They had like a free 30-day trial. So I was on the site for 30 days, and I wanted to get like the most out of those 30 days. And I was basically doing searches for Virtual Boy. Like I wanted to see, like, find me all the newspaper articles that talked about the Virtual Boy, find me any sort of reference about the Virtual Boy, to sort of understand like what was the press saying and so on. And this site has basically scans of like newspapers from all over the country, all over the United States. And I started to realize that there's this, you could tell just from looking at the newspapers, and I mean, it's obvious in hindsight, but you like never make that connection, that when when things started to go south, is you start to see these ad campaigns, the same ad showing up in, 50, 100 different newspapers all across the country with a specific sale. For example, like I'll make up names here, like Sears, Virtual Boy now, 10% off and a free bank game if you buy one now. And you kind of start to see that writing on the walls, like, things are not going well because they're doing a sale. And then this, like 2 weeks later, there's another set of a different ad with a different promotion. And so you can kind of see the thing, like, he's like, oh no, this is not going to end well because there's too many sales happening too often, and the discounts are getting deeper and deeper. And I just thought that was fascinating to kind of see that play out, air quotes, in real time as I'm basically going through these newspaper clippings that newspapers.com was like throwing up to me and seeing like, oh, look, this is in Kansas. Oh, look, same time, same date sometimes. This is in, Wisconsin. This is in Illinois. This one's in South Carolina. And it's the same ad, the same message. And then I like fast forward a couple of days or whatever it was, and you're seeing a different ad with the same kind of thing. it's a kind of research that you can't do. Like if you want to do that now for like a media campaign, like could you like is that even recorded anywhere? And I'm sort of like that's one of the lost one things we lost were like newspapers going away, magazines going away, and all the rest of that is being able to go back and like kind of see that pattern playing out. Like where would you go to now? You could like maybe there's a YouTube video and you can see YouTube. I don't know. Like it seems like we've lost something. And I thought that was kind of cool to see that play out. And I captured a lot of those ads and I sent them to Planet Virtual Boy, for example, not all of them, because obviously they like repeat. So here's 500 of the same ad from 5 different newspapers, from 500 newspapers. And we decided not to put that in the book. It was just like, oh, this feels like too much going into the weeds. And also it was more about like advertising than about the device itself. So we kind of left that out.
Yeah, remember what they took from us. Video game sales. Advertisements. Black Friday deals, so on and so forth. That is absolutely phenomenal. I never really thought about that, but now that you mentioned it, and I'm sure every listener and chatter and viewer is going to agree that anytime we see a game or a console going on sale, we're all going to be like, oh no, it's the beginning of the end. Why?
The thing is, when you're in it, you might not notice, right? So it's like, hey, cool, they're doing a sale on, on this thing and it's 20% off or whatever. You're like, cool, you buy it. But once you bought it, you're not paying attention to like then 3 weeks later, like the discount got a bit deeper, or they've added a game for free, or any of that kind of stuff. And it's also happening across the country, essentially, in different newspapers, which was also weird. Nowadays, you're getting your targeted advertisement on your social media or whatever, so you might not even be aware that there's a campaign happening. Essentially,
it's true. So we are at the Q&A portion. So thank you so much for your interview. I learned a lot about the Virtual Boy. I learned it's so bizarre because it's like, well, I read the book, so what else could like that's the tip of the iceberg of the knowledge of the Virtual Boy that you have, which is so incredible and impressive. And I'm really excited for this series to continue so that I can interview a bunch of people and find out like just all the knowledge that is in your brain that did not go into the book. It's awesome. The first question that I saw from chat, and Chris, feel free to start pasting those in because I think there are a couple that I saw. But the first one I saw that I think was maybe asked a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I think it is actually a really interesting question because when you're writing a book, at least in the initial stage, you're not concerned about copyright, or at least, sorry, I don't know. Jose's probably a really responsible person. For me, when I'm writing a book, I'm like, I'll worry about getting copyright and getting permission to use images and stuff later. So the question was, if Nintendo has this, if Nintendo's so precious about their reputation and had such a reaction to negative press or opinions about the Virtual Boy, did you face any of that when writing this book, or did you have to secure permissions to use any of the images or articles, and did you have to deal with Nintendo's legal team in any capacity?
Well, the answer is I did not get any permissions from anybody. For any of the images that we use. They're either created by ourselves, as in myself or Benj. A lot of the screenshots in the games we created, the screenshots created out of like emulators. And I have copies of all the games that we were using. And so we sort of felt like that's okay. And in the context of US copyright law, there is fair use. And MIT Press was very much on board the idea that showing screenshots and stuff like that all falls easily within fair use. So they weren't too concerned. They didn't push back. It's like, hey, you need to get permission from Nintendo to do these things. They were like, no need. Just make sure that if you're using other stuff that other people did, like let's make sure we have the right attributions, that kind of stuff. One of the things I really wanted to talk to people at Nintendo. Nintendo's very closed, and they wouldn't talk to us. And this isn't quite cutting room floor, but the story we don't tell is what was happening in Japan, right? Because sure, it didn't do so well in the U.S. and got canceled in the U.S. But what was going on in Japan and why? And the marketing campaign in Japan was not the same as what was happening in the U.S. There was no Blockbuster, and so on. And so that's a big hole in the sense that if we were to like do a second edition of the book, what would be the easiest next step addition to that would be to properly examine what was happening in Japan. I don't speak Japanese. I don't read Japanese, so maybe we'd have to find a third author who could contribute that and expertise and that knowledge. I think also enough time had passed that they weren't necessarily going to come out like swinging at us for writing about the Virtual Boy. But I really wanted to basically say, hey, can you guys confirm some of the stuff? There's a couple of stories in the book that we talk about as where I speculate and say, like, okay, this was happening. There's rumors that never got out there. This is what might have happened internally. One of the, for example, is that Nintendo was actually working on two kinds of stereoscopic devices at the same time, two different units within Nintendo. One through Jetson and Argonaut, and then the Virtual Boy separately. And the Argonaut one got canceled, right? And Jetson, who worked on that, sort of publicly talked about, like, well, they canned it because, it was Gunpei's favorite project, and that one was not going to get killed. So the one I was working on got killed. Nintendo did partner with Argonaut, and they spent, I forget, it was like $1 million at least. So there's a sizable investment that they put into this other, I'll call it like a VR project in air quotes. We don't know what happened to that. If there's prototypes of it, like early kind of things have been like very scant and hard. I was able to actually get some interviews with a Japanese developer who worked on some of the Japanese games. And that was thanks to John, I pronounce his last name, Spetsjensiak. I'm saying it all wrong, I'm so sorry. Who did a Kickstarter where he was going to go to Japan, just interview a bunch of Japanese game developers. And if you kickstarted at a certain level, you could kind of ask him special requests. So I kickstarted at that level, tell him, like, hey, please talk to anybody who worked on a virtual game. And he was able to talk to one of the programmers for Red Alarm. And so obviously his interview showed up in his book, and then I was able to quote from that book in mine, because he was able to do all the interviewing and the translations. That was kind of a roundabout way of getting a source for information that I couldn't get myself, because someone else was super happy to do it in the context of their book. The title of John's book, I think it's The Untold History of Japanese Game Developers, and it's like 3 volumes. So definitely check those out too, because they're super interesting.
You are not only playing 5D chess over here, but you're also playing the long game. When you talked about how long this book was in development, I thought maybe you were exaggerating or speaking in the sense of like, oh, well, I'd been like kicking this idea around for a few years, but no, like, that is serious. That's amazing. That's so cool. There's another really awesome question from chat, which is, what did you learn that you didn't expect to learn, or that changed your mindset on the Virtual Boy?
One of the things that reputation, there's a bunch of stuff that I already talked about, so it's something new. Virtual Boy has a sort of reputation of giving people headaches. And I have I think I have an explanation for why that was the case. Because I think it's kind of unwarranted. Now, to be fair, I think that there are people that get dizzy just watching like a first-person shooter game on the screen, and that's a thing that happens for sure. Some people get dizzy in VR, moving head around. That's a thing, and we've gotten better at understanding why that happens. The Virtual Boy specifically, people just talk like, oh, I've been playing this thing for 30 minutes, now I have like massive headache. My take on it is that the main reason for that happening was people not configuring the Virtual Boy correctly. So along the top of the Virtual Boy, there's like a slider that basically is to regulate like how far apart the displays are. There's an ideal spot for the 3D effect to work best. It's like the distance between your pupils. I might be getting some of the details wrong here, but basically the idea is that you're supposed to toggle this thing and set it to like the size of your head essentially, and or I guess how far apart your eyes are. And my hypothesis is a lot of people just didn't do this and just started using it because it still looks fine. But if you didn't fine tune that, you're more likely to get headaches afterwards. I thought it was interesting. There was a research study I found where they were using the Virtual Boy to help kids, do spatial recognition stuff. And in that research study, they didn't complain about like their study participants getting headaches. My guess is, again, it's because they made sure like we're going to do this test, right? Where you're going to play this game and do these things. So they basically made sure to configure it right. They did have those explanations in the manual, but I think even back then, like, you don't read the manual before you start necessarily. You're just like, oh, I'm going to plug it in and let's go.
Absolutely.
I've never had
That's
headaches,
absolutely what I do.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Even my eye trackers, I have to calibrate. So that's pretty standard. I mean, not that the eye tracker, it's infrared. It's not going to.
To be clear, I'm not saying that if you got a headache, it's because you set it up wrong.
No, you're totally blaming the user. It's fine.
What I'm saying is that I'm pretty sure that for most headaches, maybe you didn't set it up right.
Yeah, I mean, no, but
Most, but not all. That's what I want to be clear.
yeah, to your point, there's a reason now that we've in user experience design and user research, we accept the fact that people don't read manuals. In fact, we don't even have manuals for games anymore because we know people won't read them. So we have to have tooltips on screen and things like that to ensure that folks aren't getting headaches. But I love that. I love that little fact because this also helps us think about accessibility as a larger issue, and it's not always just the hardware, but thinking about how we can train people to adapt their technology to them is really important. I mean, that's been instrumental in user experience design.
Yeah. Actually, I think I'm going to say this, and then people can prove me wrong, but the Virtual Boy might be the first video game device, like mass market commercial video game device, that actually had, in the act of playing games, like warnings to the users, like, hey, maybe you need to take a break now.
Really?
When we came out, we was kind of like, oh, people were like super, it was like a news story essentially that it would remind you every now and then to take a break and like don't injure yourself playing the Wii and so on. There are similar warnings in the Virtual Boy for a lot of the games. So, and it's actually part of the hardware. You can like toggle whether or not you want to show these warnings or not. So it's something that they don't show up in all the games, but that was the developer of that game's decision rather than the Nintendo definitely supported your ability as a developer to like have those messages.
That's incredible. That's actually a really cool factoid. I'm glad you threw that in there. We have one final question from chat, which is something to think about in terms of marketing, which is neither your nor my expertise, but perhaps you came across this in the development of the book, which is this idea that Nintendo and Sega both heavily marketed a single character, so Mario or Sonic, and the Virtual Boy didn't have a character associated with it. That's true?
Yes, it didn't have. It's weird. A lot of the first run of ad campaigns in the US, actually, the Virtual Boy itself was kind of a character. There's these ads that were kind of like a Mad Max post-apocalyptic future, and there's these like shaggy people that look like post-apocalyptic survivors, essentially, kind of running around. And there's this Virtual Boy on its like stand, kind of hunting them. So in that sense, the device itself was kind of like a character, but it didn't have a mascot for sure. In the US, the Virtual Boy was released with Mario Tennis, which I think it might be the first Mario Tennis game. That's maybe another first for the Virtual Boy there. So Mario was definitely front and center for the device, as it were. The Virtual Boy is also, so Nintendo did actually use a lot of its IP in its characters for its own games. So there's two Mario games, if I remember correctly. There's a Wario game as well, and Wario as a character wasn't as big as important as a character as Wario is now. At that point, I think he had only showed up maybe in one game part. That might have been a Game Boy game, a Game Boy Color game. The Virtual game was like a big, like AAA kind of like front and center. This is a Wario game for sure. So it didn't have a distinctive mascot, but the Mario characters were definitely part of the device in at least 3 games. And maybe I'm making a mistake. It's also one of the early Persona games. There isn't a Persona title per se. But some of the characters from that would later become like the Persona games are also in one of the Virtual Boy games.
Whoa!
I'm probably gonna regret saying Persona. This might be like a different franchise, but yeah, the games were like, what? That was a game with those characters. That's like part of the official lore of this world. Like, yep, they had a Virtual Boy game.
That's a deep cut.
Jack Bros is the game I'm thinking of. I'm pretty sure it's like Persona. Pretty wrong.
That's a deep cut. We are well and truly over time. And I'm so grateful that you've been so patient and so kind and so generous with your time tonight. So chat, join me, please, in thanking Professor Zagal for his time and expertise in talking about Seeing Red, Nintendo's Virtual Boy. Round of applause. Listen to the live studio audience.
There we go.
They love it.
Thank you. This has been super fun for me. And thanks for the opportunity. And I guess I should say, like, go read the book.
It's free, so there's no excuse, right? So do you have anything that you'd like to plug besides Seeing Red, Nintendo's Virtual Boy? Do you have any new publications or any other creative works or anything that you'd like to talk about, that you'd like chat to know about?
Sure. So I guess the scholarly thing would be to, like, you could take a look at my Google Scholar profile page, there's a list of like all my publications. Many of them are freely available to read. You can download PDFs and so on. If it's not, you can always reach out to me directly. I am on Blue Sky. I'm blanking on my Blue Sky username. I think it's Jose J Zagal, J-Z-A-G-A-L on Blue Sky. If you go to the Virtual Boy book on MIT Press website and you click on like my name, you can see another MIT Press book I have out on 50 years of Dungeons and Dragons. That's the book I co-edited with Ramit Sidhu and Marcus Carter. That's also a super fun book if you're into D&D. If you go to playstorypress.org and you look for book authors, you can also find some of my books there on game design. Game Design Snacks is a book also edited. It's a kind of book with a lot of short little snippets of game design wisdom, if that's your jam. If you're into role-playing games, I'll also recommend the Routledge Handbook of Role-Playing Game Studies. This one's priced, it's a hardcover, so it's priced for like libraries, but the ebook I think is much more accessible. And it kind of looks at role-playing game studies. It's very academic, so it's like an academic, like big picture kind of book. Happy, you reach out to me. You can find my email. It's not that hard.
It's a big picture book.
Message me.
In the sense that it's a picture book and the pictures are very big. The photos are very big, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's only pictures and pop-up pictures. So absolutely. As in true academic fashion. Pages are made of cardboard. There's only like 8 pages and there's flaps. You can open flaps and discover things.
Yep. They're drool proof too. So if you chew on them or get drool on
washable,
them.
Washable books.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So thank you so much again, Jose. Thank you also for your very positive attitude as we're joking around. I have a bunch of people to thank at the end of this presentation. So first of all, I want to thank you so much to Shawn Pierre for the creation and use of the theme song, and also Adrianna Poindexter as well for doing the vocals on that. To Nifty Chris, the Twitch mod, for classroom management and keeping us all safe. And obviously to you, the viewers, and especially if you're listening to this after the fact, podcast listeners, thank you so much. Without you, this would not be possible. Listeners, viewers, chatters, if you liked this stream, VOD or podcast, please make sure you are following with your notifications turned on so that you know when we're live again. That is amazing. Jose just pulled out his Virtual Boy. He's got a Virtual Boy right there. You kept this knowledge door locked this entire time. When we were... chat's going wild. When we were doing our audio checks, Jose did not let me know. Thought there was a Virtual Boy. Okay, so if you're watching this after the fact, head on over to twitch.tv/professor_Ashley and make sure you give a follow there. You can also find me on almost all social media platforms under Professor Ashley so that you know when we are live again, which we will be live again. The Research Left Behind will be live again on May 22nd with special guest Dr. Jim Malazita, who will be talking about his book, Enacting Platforms, The Techno-Feminism of the Unreal Engine. This is another open access book from MIT Press. I promise you this stream is not sponsored, although MIT Press was kind enough to shout the stream out on social media, which I very much appreciate. This just happens to be the 2 books that I discovered. So you can read it beforehand, and Dr. Malazita will be on hand to answer any questions you have, just like Jose was tonight. So there's so much swag, so much drip is happening off screen. I love this. Any final thoughts or final words, Jose?
Thanks for watching. Thanks for being interested in the Virtual Boy, and thanks Ashley for hosting, and thanks to your team and crew for making this super fun, super smooth, no technical issues that I'm aware of. This has been great. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you all so much. Good night, everyone. And I think we can roll credits. Bye.